we're going to look at tuning into felt sense. And in order to look at tuning into felt sense, I need to let you know what felt sense is, what is meant by felt sense. Now, when I was talking about conceptualizations in the first main audio, I mentioned that there isn't a single concept that doesn't contain information about body states. And this is because we use our conceptual systems to operate predictively. And one of the most important things that we need to predict is how to deploy the resources of our body. And this can mean, when I say the resources of our body, I'm talking about, in simple terms, where we place energy, how we use energy within our body. So sometimes we might need our sympathetic nervous system, our fight-flight system to be in arousal because we need to take action in the world. And other times we might need our parasympathetic nervous system to be in ascendancy so that we can heal, repair, digest food, consolidate learnings, this kind of thing. And that's just a crude level. Really, our bodies are an ongoing cascade of hormonal communications, neurological communications, all of these sorts of things that subtly adjust cellular activity in different ways so that our body can show up most effectively within the context of our lives and do the things we want to do. Think about it. We are physically always in movement and always doing. We are always physically showing up and engaging with our context through behaviors. And this behavior is driven through how our body deploys resources and moves us. So every concept, for this reason, in order to be useful, has to contain information about body states on some level. And this leads to something particularly interesting. It leads to a connection with what Eugene Gendlin, the psychologist Eugene Gendlin, has called felt sense. Now let me tell you a little something about Eugene Gendlin and felt sense. Eugene Gendlin was a psychotherapist, psychologist, clinical psychologist, and I think this was back in the 60s, maybe 70s, that he was doing, developing this concept. And what he found was, like many psychotherapists or clinical psychologists find, is that some clients would do very well in the therapy that he offered, and some clients just really, he didn't seem to get anywhere with at all. And he became very curious about what the difference was between the clients who would do well versus the clients who wouldn't. And so he decided to start paying attention and to coming up with some kind of answer to this conundrum. And he did. And what he concluded was that the clients that did well in therapy had a capacity to tune into themselves. He could see their attention moving in particular ways. Now, people who are NLP trained, they'll get this. They'll get that when you start paying attention to people, you can start seeing where their attention is going. You start getting certain clues about what's going on inside of them through what's expressed through their physiology. This is called sensory acuity in NLP. And calibration, because you can calibrate, you can start to get a sense of the physiological picture that you see and how that correlates to different internal states in a person. So you can see when a client is connected into like a full body processing versus when a client is all up in their head, all up in logical, rational things, sort of disconnected from the body. So Gendlin saw that people who did well in the kind of therapy that he was doing seemed to be able to tune into their body and work with the messages coming from their body, subtle messages coming from outside of consciousness. And it's not even when the clients were tuning into them, they were conscious that they were tuning into them. They just kind of were. It was part of how they were doing their thinking, doing it in more of an embodied and full-bodied way. So Gendlin conceptualized this as people tuning into their felt sense. And he got so good at seeing this, he could pretty much see whether someone was going to do well in therapy, like after watching a videotape for 30 or 40 seconds, just seeing how they responded, how they were being. So what Eugene Gendlin did is he decided that, well, if this is a key component, the ability to connect into felt sense, what he would do is he would make it his business to teach people who were not especially tuned in, were not working with their felt sense, to teach people to use their felt sense, to connect with their felt sense, to start processing in more of a full body way. Now, what's important to understand here is when Gendin's talking about felt sense, he's not talking about raw emotions. He's talking about subtler stuff, often the stuff that lies underneath of emotions, that most people are not aware of most of the time. Now I'm going to share a little model with you to do with concepts, and it's the two-way model of conceptualization, or the two functions model of conceptualization. Sometimes share this with clients, and I normally do this up on a whiteboard, so I'm going to do this by audio. I'd normally draw this up. So let's put concept. Imagine I'm writing concept in the middle of a blank whiteboard. And sometimes with clients I just write thinking or thoughts up here rather than concepts, because I haven't talked about this stuff around conceptualization. I don't really want to go there. I want to keep it simple with them. So I put thinking. But we're going to put conceptualization right in the middle of the whiteboard. And then I explain to my client, I say, there are two functions to conceptualization, or two functions to thinking. The first one, and I draw an arrow upwards, the first one is to point out to the world, to get a handle on the world. So I write, point to the world at the top. So what I mean by this is if I have the concept of chair, when I think about a chair, well, that concept exists for me to reach out into the world and engage with the things that we call chairs and be able to use them. When I say, can you go to the shops and get me some milk? There's a whole bunch of concepts there pointing to things in the world, making a request of another person to take an action. And this is what we're doing. So the concepts are there to give us a handle upon the world, to help us bring ourselves to bear upon the world. They point out to the world, the concepts do. So that's the first function of concepts and conceptualization. The second function, and I draw an arrow downwards on the board, is that they create our experience. This is the second function, so I'll write this at the bottom. So we've got conceptualization, or concepts or thoughts. They point out to the world and reach out to the world and connect us with the world, number one. And number two, they create our experience of the world. Now, out of these two functions, the first one, thought, conceptualization, does highly imperfectly. Whatever you think it is out there in the world, you're wrong, because the thing out there in the world isn't made of words or concepts. It's a thing that's beyond words and concepts that we're using words and concepts to reach out to. So the first function of reaching out to the world is imperfect, highly imperfect. But the second function of concepts creating our experience, of thoughts, the things that we think deeply, pre-linguistically, shaping our experience, this second function is absolutely perfect. Every concept we use will create the experience that it creates within us perfectly. Now, most of the time, the experience that our conceptualization creates for us is outside of consciousness, because our consciousness is being directed by it. Again, I've said this before, we cannot see what we're seeing the world through. So we don't get the experience of the concept we're using. We don't see the experience of the concept we're using because we're embedded in it, like a fish is embedded in water. Now, what this means is that when people are speaking and using words, which we've seen are attached to concepts, a lot of the time they will be doing so in an auto-suggestion fashion that is creating an experience for them. And they don't even know they're doing it. They think, as we've discussed before, they're just describing things rather than creating them. So one of the things that I will often do with people when I'm working with clients, it's something I often do. If I see that when the client is conceptualizing in a particular way, their state shifts, they drop into a particular trance that is not serving them, is shutting them down from responses, I will often assist them in becoming aware of this, assist them in tuning into the felt sense of the concepts that they use. Now, I'll give you an example, and you may have heard me use this example elsewhere because it's the stock example I use and have been using for years. I once had a client who came to me for some coaching client rather than a change work client, and he wanted to get his career back on track. Now, every time he would say that phrase, I just want to get my career back on track, whenever he said the word career, I could see a shift, a little micro expression. Something was going on. So I said to him, just let me check something out with you for a moment. Just allow yourself to be aware of your inner sense, of your inner sensation. And just say that word to yourself, career, and see what comes up for you. And he said the word, and he said, oh, it's like a kind of a dread. Dread. So he was feeling the word consciously. He was getting into the felt sense of the word consciously. Now that doesn't mean that felt sense, that experiential stuff wasn't there all the rest of the time he was using it. He just wasn't consciousness of it. So by tuning into the felt sense of it, he could start tuning into how this particular piece of self-hypnosis he was doing was not serving him, because he could get into the felt sense. Let me give you another example, second example, a more recent client that I was working with. And this client was telling me that he was worried about a number of circumstances in his life. He was worried about this, he was worried about the fact that he had a car that had problems going on and it was costing him a lot of money, and he was worried about his work, and he was worried about a lot of things. He was telling me how worried he was. So I did a little tune in on felt sense. And I said to him, I just want you to check in and say the words to yourself that you've just said. Really feel. I said, imagine these words had a sort of energy, sort of feel to them. Really allow yourself to be aware of what occurs in your body. And just say the words, I'm worried about the car. And notice what comes up. And now, just take a breath in and change it. And say to yourself, I'm worrying about the car. And he toggled backwards and forwards between the two. I'm worried about the car and I'm worrying about the car. And he lit up and he said, wow, that's totally different. I said, how is it totally different? He said, when I'm worrying about the car, I don't know, I just get the sense that there's something I can do. But when I'm worried about the car, it just feels like I can't do anything, like the worry's on top of me. Now there's an example of felt sense. He would have thought nothing of saying I'm worried about the car. He would have thought that was simply a description of a state of affairs that were factually true. But remember, description is creation. So this is how autosuggestion works. Description is creation. So this is one way we can start using felt sense. When we start tuning into what's going on in our bodies, really paying attention, we can start becoming aware of how our habitual autosuggestion patterns are influencing and affecting us. And are they moving us towards being how we would like to be or away from? It's a very important area, and it's very difficult to master self-hypnosis if you don't get this. If you don't get how your habitual autosuggestions are working upon you. So another way that felt sense is useful is when you just have feelings going on, senses, sensations. You can reverse engineer this and you can get something of your concepts by going the other way. So what I've just described is going from concept to felt sense, but we can go from felt sense to concept. We can go in the other direction as well. And here's how you might do this. If you've got some sense or sensation going on, now you wouldn't do this if everything is as it needs to be, but if you get the sense that something is wrong, something is amiss, you can feel your way into your body and be present with the felt sense. Now, if there's a strong emotion in your body, sometimes you need to move it to one side to notice the subtler feelings underneath. Really tune into the subtle feelings and ask yourself the question, what could this be about? And you will get information coming up about where your attention is going and how you're conceptualizing things. Now, again, I want to give a concrete example here because otherwise, if that stays in the realm of the abstract, it won't necessarily help us. And I'm going to give an example. Again, this is an example I've given elsewhere. So it's a standard teaching example for me, although I haven't used it for a while. Give an example of a number of years ago, a couple of 3 years ago, I can't remember. I know I was doing improv theatre at the time. I was learning improv theatre. And I used to do a lot of stuff for self-development. I still do. This is one of the things I did for a bit to develop my flexibility and communication skills. So I was doing improv theatre. And I was having a day where I just really wasn't looking forward to going. I just felt really kind of like, sort of a bit flat, a bit bummed out, a bit just not feeling good. Just really fancied just laying low, taking it easy, hiding in a corner or something, sort of hiding from the world. But I was aware I had to go out to improv. I didn't have to, but I was choosing to. So I did my best to put those feelings to one side and just, get on with the day. And I did this, and the day rolled on. It just kept coming up, And I went to improv in the evening, and it just wasn't really a good session because I was just, as I say, I felt like I really just wanted to lay low, go hide in a corner, hibernate for a bit. So I'd done my best to put this out of my mind. I'd done my best to directly change my state by ignoring the feelings and doing something else, and it just didn't work. So on this occasion, and this is not, actually this must be a fair while ago now, I'm saying a couple of years, it must be a fair while because I'd probably reasonably recently been introduced to the concept of felt sense. I was certainly making a lot of use of it at the time. So I decided instead of trying to push away these feelings, I would just bring my attention to them. Just be really present with them and ask myself the question, what could this be about? And I asked the question and I stayed, and then it just came up intuitively. It's about Bob. Now, let me give you some context. Bob, and I'm not using his real name here, Bob was somebody I knew, a friend of mine, who I'd agreed to a business deal with. And it was a business deal that, quite frankly, was all in Bob's favour and not really a lot in my favour. And, Bob's a good guy. I like Bob. I wanted to help Bob out, which is kind of why I'd got into the business deal. But it was going to be a lot of work for me for not a lot of reward. And I just felt that I wanted to extricate myself from this business deal. I wanted to get out of it. I wasn't thinking about this consciously, but clearly unconsciously it was there, playing in my awareness. So it's about Bob. So I checked him a little bit more. What about Bob? What is it about Bob? And what came up was I want to get out of this deal, but I want to do so without offending Bob or upsetting Bob. And that's what came up. And that was a real breakthrough for me. And the reason it was a breakthrough for me was because I realized what it was that was stopping me just making the decision that was in the best interest of my needs. It was this concern about Bob being offended. Now, from what I know that my worry about Bob being offended is exactly as we discussed earlier on in the previous audio. It's me focusing my attention on what's outside of my sphere of power. So I already know that's a bad idea. My transcendent self understands that that's a bad idea. So go, right, I see it. But what is it that really needs to happen here? And I could also ask myself a pragmatic question. Okay, so how do I extricate myself from this and, be really clear, how do I extricate myself from this in such a way that I can remain grounded in my choices and do so in a way that is respectful of Bob. As a web, it isn't going to bend over backwards to accommodate Bob at my expense, if that makes sense. So yeah, that was the direction that I kind of went in with this, and it was an extremely useful thing. So what you can get now, I want to put a caveat on this. I'm thinking this in the back of my mind as I'm saying this. I used to use felt sense a lot many years ago. I use it slightly differently now. When that information comes up, what I'm also interested about is how I'm conceptualizing. I'm not just taking that as some facts that emerge from the felt sense. It is about Bob, and I do not want to offend Bob. Those are not facts, those are thoughts. Those are conceptualizations. So I also want to be able to look at those conceptualizations and see how they are working for me. It isn't just about taking them as facts and changing my action accordingly. Sometimes that's the easiest solution. But a lot of the time, you might want to adjust the conceptualizations as well. So with regard to adjusting conceptualizations, going back to the client I mentioned earlier who said he wanted to get his career back on track. Well, throughout the coaching going forward, we just burned that concept, career. We stopped using it. We found a different way for him to talk about that created a different experience for him, and therefore enabled him to achieve the results that he wanted to get without the unconscious block that was occurring. So this is why felt sense is a really useful thing. Now, what I'm going to suggest to you is that I've already suggested you start tracking your trances, so to speak, your trance repertoires, particularly looking for toxic trances, the things that you get the sense when you ask the question about it, is this serving me? Is this trance really serving me? Is this moving me more towards how I would want to live my life, who I would want to be, or is it keeping me from that? And of course, as I recommended before, this isn't judging a trance as, you're bad, or anything like that. It's evaluating a trance. Is this serving me? But also meeting the trance with understanding and accepting and recognition. And we've already talked about that. But what I'm going to add on to this now is that you then, once you're able to be with this without judgment, but really attend to it, tune into the felt sense of it. Find the center of it, the felt sense of it. Allow yourself to be with it and ask yourself the question, what could this be about? And write these things down. What comes up? What could this be about? Write down anything that comes up. And make sure you don't get too caught up into your intellectualizations. If you get pulled up into your head, return to the felt sense. Start writing down what comes up. Because what you're going to get come up is you're going to get statements that contain belief structurings inside of them. It may be obvious belief structurings, or they may be implicit, they may be hidden under the surface. This is an important thing with regard to self-hypnosis and self-transformation and personal alchemy. We want to be able to access how we're making sense of the world. And given that how we're making sense of things is unconscious to us, because we're experiencing through that, we want to bring this to the surface. And felt sense is the way to do it. And starting to write down what comes up is the way to do it. If we want to really transform the structures of these trances. There's some other tricks as well that I'm going to teach you, which can have you sidestep this, can help you shift in the moment. But ultimately, if you really want to transform the foundations of the trances that you're living by, you want to be able to get into the base material through felt sense. It's an imperfect process, but it's a very doable process, and you can get some really useful information come out.